My name's Kate Mulholland, and this is my painting installation of Dora Maar at Foltz Fine Art. This painting that I made and the painting behind it and the murals is from the note-taking that I did while in residency at La Maison Dora Maar in Manerbe, France. The painting was made, a series of paintings was made while in residency at La Maison Dora Maar that was around the idea that time is not linear, but we experience it and organize it in a linear fashion. And it all has to play on the idea that like the human brain is incapable of fathoming our construct of time, which is funny because we came up with it, but at the same time it's like there's no way that we can process 4.3 billion years of history. We're just like, that's a really long time ago. So my whole goal when going to this residency was to make a formula of kind of like, what is the timeline of time that I'm working in, and try to find indexes throughout a local place's history of what I can use to like indicate like, and then this happened, and people will be like, oh, I have a mental picture of that. So the whole goal of this residency was to develop a methodology of how to express nonlinear time in a fashion that our brains could digest it. Which to me, the perfect formula would be through abstract painting, something that is nonlinear and not just imagery, but also in narrative. And so, of course, the residency was taking place at Dora Maar's residence, summer home. And what better place to do it than there? Manerbe has a long history of Roman occupation, of prehistoric humans, agriculture, and also a really cool fossil record. So it was really the perfect place to try this out because it was an overabundance, a cornucopia of information to kind of sort out. One of the first things I did when I arrived at that residency, because for a number of reasons, there was a bunch of holidays and I wasn't able to acquire paint. And so I took that time to kind of get it all out on paper and draw out this timeline. So the timeline behind us in this mural is actually snippets from the 6 foot by 6 foot radical drawing that I did, and with just magic markers and ballpoint pens and everything. So, but I wanted to organize the chaos a little bit so it can really showcase the chaos of the painting. So the world has this incredible history that we've been unpacking through stone that can basically decode every landscape that we have, that we interface with. It also plays into subsurface studies, things like petrology and all the things we use for energy today. But these studies are really important too to how a place was made. And so one of the first things that I was interested in was how did modern history, modern as in like Romans to now, interacted with the land because of what it provided. And Manerbe's, because of Roman occupation, had Roman dwellings that people still lived in. It also has a carriage house, and then not too far away are the ochres, the Luberon ochres, and those ochre deposits were made before any human walked the earth there. And that paired with the limestone, the history of the ocean beneath, was just like a really cool setting. So how I constructed the painting started off with the idea of working with limestone and ochres. So the Manerbian limestone is a famous type of limestone that's still quarried today, and it's high end. And so it's used for mainly architectural purposes, but it's shipped all over the world. This is something that people like acquire specifically for this location's qualities. So I wanted to use that as like the surface of the painting and really play that up, and then pull in the ochres that are nearby as something like that has touched all of art history. So the Romans mined it for pigment to dye their clothes and to wash their houses with, and produce documents, all these different things. And then throughout art history, it's like where, you know, your Dutch floral painters were sourcing their burnt umbers and all the other earth tones, what they call them, lake pigments, basically. So that's what I wanted to expose when I was carving, was kind of like that interaction. So if you look at the side of the painting, you can see each layer exposed, and that's the same strata that's being excavated when I carve. The paintings on top were, so it started off with a landscape. So the landscape painting that's on the piece is a view from outside Dora Maar's window looking at Mont Ventoux. The black part is combining both a close-up image of one of her more surrealist felt tip drawings that are very gestural, as well as images of the waterways that comprise the Tethys Sea that formed the region. The dots carved out of the work on the left side are stand-ins for stars that are in the Catholic cathedrals, painted on the ceilings, usually in gold, and it's for the celestial skies or celestial heavens. In the same vein and around the same time, there's also a lot of decoration happening with the Star of David because of the Jewish diaspora in that region. It's very ancient. There's a lot of migration to and from Spain and then up to Poland and Eastern Europe. So I really wanted to play with those two because those two religions have a lot of place here on the house's property. So the drawing that Picasso did of the crying woman, a lot of people think that it's just one painting, but it's many, many more. It's actually a motif that he kept making throughout his career. So this is a drawing, one of the drawings of one of the paintings that is famous for as the crying woman. But it was made as a mockery to Dora Maar. And it's something that even after their time together, he still kept doing, which is wild considering that she had her own career in the arts. So it definitely, like, he was trying to bury her to a certain extent. And so that image I really wanted to incorporate into the painting as more like a female rage symbol, less than a symbol of abuse. And I think it's really part of the iconography that speaks upon resilience in the face of trauma and just of how people deal with emotions and processing. I wanted to combine them with a lot of Dora Maar's drawings because people know her as like a surrealist photographer. That's some of her more famous work. But when you look on the market today, it's actually a lot of her drawings from the time when she was doing abstraction of landscape. And it was during a period of her life where she was still very much healing and searching for herself and trying to like reinvent a career or reinvent how she participates in creative acts. And it was by another artist who was in residence in Minerves during that time frame, which I didn't realize how much of a cultural hub it was for artists, or kind of like a hangout it was for artists back in the 40s and 50s. But there were apparently several notable artists that were in residence there. Several other drawings and map references throughout the piece. There's one called Herbs, which is, it looks like almost like rosemary. So that's one of the ones that I carved into it, because along the countryside, you'll just see random gigantic bushes that are like 100 years old of rosemary. Like their stalks look like trees. Like, it's really cool. And then there's also the Durance River, which is a part of the Rhone River system. So if you drink wine, the Rhone River Valley is a really important one to winemakers, but so is the Durance. And that area is just really, really important geologically to winemaking, because it was kind of like a proving area to figure out how communes can unite and really keep the business going during hard times. One might remember the Great Blight of the old vine vineyards. So a lot of the ancient vineyards were dying off because of this blight. And it's really interesting that actually Texas was one of the members of saving it, because one of these vines were illegally brought to Texas to try to figure out how to make better wine, because the Mediterranean environment and the hill country are very, very similar. Well, it turned out they created a blight-resistant plant, but also that plant was able to be brought back as like one of the last living stalks of these things to help that area make wine again. This is like all of France, to my knowledge. Like, this is universally like the one single strand of grape, and I can't remember exactly which one it was, but it's one, if someone drinks wine, they're like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. Dora Maar is a very interesting character. She, throughout her earlier years, before and during and briefly after, she was a kind of the life of a party. She was a big attitude. At that time, women weren't supposed to be that big. They weren't supposed to be that bold, brash, outspoken. She was all of those things. And she was running in surrealist circles and made a name for herself independently without even Picasso being involved. So, and then when they got together, they were kind of a, on the exterior at least, like an unstoppable force. Truly a power couple. And then once Picasso left her essentially for a 15-year-old girl, he gave her this home as like kind of a consolation prize. And it's something like during the war, he had a patron that couldn't pay him for a painting. So they gave him basically this derelict piece of property. And it was a old Spanish general's home from one of the wars in Spain. This thing was already ancient by the time Dora Maar had it. So she had to put a lot of work and like really fix it up. And I think that was a big part of her like healing practice and into finding herself. But also there's more complexity with that in the whole context of World War II. So Dora Maar grew up without necessarily religion in her home. Her mother was, I believe her mother was Catholic. Her dad may or may not have been Jewish, but definitely had a last name that was. And she was born Henriette Theodora Markovich, was her original name before she donned the moniker Dora Maar. So she went about her life without having to think about it pretty much until World War II started happening. And I believe that's when she doubled down on the Dora Maar name, because it hid her any type of questionable origin. Now, was she Jewish? There is no actual documentation of it being, Judaism was passed down through the mother's, not through the father's bloodline. So it's highly possible that she could have been a couple generations removed from anyone who was actually Jewish, but still having a name like that would have been highly problematic during World War II. It was also kind of a big deal when she converted to Catholicism, which I don't know if she actually converted to Catholicism or if she just kind of picked up with her roots, but it was made in research that I've made, or research that I've looked at, it was made to sound like she converted to it. So my assumption was that she was essentially like religiousess, because of her home, her upbringing was never really a big part of her life. And then after Picasso, she really doubled down on Catholicism. I think one of the funniest anecdotes about that was that in Manerbe, they have a couple cathedrals there that are all really cool, very historical, from totally different parts of time. And she hated all of them. So she went to like several towns over to actually go to church because she hated it so much. And so there's so many stories of the people in Manerbe's about her on her moped, so which is still around and still running, I believe. which to me is just like so funny. It's like seeing this, this angry French woman just being like, screw you, I'm in Arabs. Yeah, she was funny like that. But also too, towards the end of her life, she's had a lot of flack because of things that she would say. I think she kind of gave up and lived like a very unfiltered life, especially when talking to people. So there's like several comments out there about that are on record in correspondence to people like gallerists and other things that maybe have the spin of her possibly being anti-Semitic, which is, to anyone who has delved into some of the questions of her background, is like highly improbable, but also very interesting, like how that would have warped into something like that. So to me, that tells me that this is a person who's gone through a lot of pain, a lot of struggle, a lot of really problematic experiences, and is just trying to make sense of it. And to me, I kind of liken that to like witchcraft and how women's suffering has historically had this connotation of like hysteria or like crazed, psychological situations, and has been really like marred throughout history. And I wanted to fully dive into that as kind of a motif that's, juxtaposes her hardcore Catholicism as like almost like a unit, like, because who she was problematic, but being problematic kind of makes an interesting person. I think later in her life, she really did embrace, to a certain extent, or lean into the fact that like a lot of people thought she was crazy, and she knew that. And she was a bit of a shut-in, so that makes total sense that she would also be, I guess the stronger parts of her personality would show. But I mean, if you went through all of that, and I feel like this is anyone who's gone through or experienced domestic violence or a situation of domestic violence, there is a whole period of healing that is that exactly. Because part of being a survivor is being confronted with a society or a group of people or even your loved ones not believing you. And it's a whole gaslighting thing that people don't even know that they're doing. So it sharpens the edges of anyone's personality that has gone through that. So that, I think, is definitely, that is something. But there's still people who, like, in the region or like, there's a whole generation of French people that still thinks that she's like some crazy woman, that she's just out there, that she was just like, oh, she's just whatever, Picasso's side piece or whatever. Whereas like there's so much more to this lady. She's so wild. So one of the things that I really was drawing a lot of connections to was the female body and its relationship to nature as something like ungovernable, natural, but also subject to mankind's control or editing and manipulation. And one thing that really inspired me while I was there is how you could watch the storms roll in. And when we think of weather as something like unpredictable. It's literally out of control, like our control, but it's a huge part of nature, and it determines whatever a place looks like. And I feel like that is something that could be really useful when talking about land in relationship to the female body, because we also too are subject to things that are completely out of our control that no one can control. And I think that paired with the whole theme of resilience really ties everything together. And but yeah, so the Allied troops and the arrows and the movements throughout are motifs that I wanted to repeat throughout the work as kind of a motif of what was happening in the region, to really emphasize how much of an impact the war had on not just the landscape of the region, but on the lives of the people there and lives that are even of the famous people that were in that region. So Operation Dragoon was an operation of the Allied forces during World War II that basically was a by sea afront, but then went on land and worked in tandem with the French resistance. Also primarily female operatives, which is something that I think over here in the States we don't really know about. Very cool, its own history. Well, Operation Dragoon happened about 2 months after D-Day. So D-Day was on the beaches of Normandy on the north. This one's on the south. This is like one of the lesser known operations. And it was really important because it shaped not only that area, but that whole region of France. The area was so economically ravaged after the war that land was really cheap, and so when people started moving back and really bolstering the economy with vineyards and all these other things, it was a really positive time. I think one of the big rifts between Dora Maar and Picasso that lifted the veil and kind of revealed what kind of a person he was to her was during World War II. So they were both actively involved with revolutionaries throughout the area, specifically that region of France, but all over France. And especially during the earlier parts of the war, they were starting to have mutual friends basically disappeared. And they knew what was going on, but the general public may not have known what was going on. And Picasso at that time was such a huge public figure that he had a lot of sway, especially in things like, politics, because a lot of the people that are purchasing were the wealthy who are involved with who? The Nazis and everyone else. And were basically complicit if they stayed in France with the war and the Vichy regime. So him not standing up or doing literally anything for these people that were a huge part of the resistance, that were either killed, captured, sent to concentration camps, or straight up disappeared, was a massive point that in people's documentations and recaps of her history really focus on. And I think that's really important because that also matches up with the whole, as a domestic abuse survivor, there's always going to be that moment or a parcel of moments that are a big reveal to be like, that's not the person I'm with, who is this person? So for her, that was really important, a really good jolt to her life. So the portrait in the back behind me is of Dora Maar, and it's a photograph she took of herself and one of her surrealist photographs. So I decided to paint that as kind of, additional layered meaning because it's in the region of the timeline where her life really was kind of drawn out and also is a part of the residency. So I kind of wanted to have people have a visual on that. Also, the red lipstick is something that's really important because red nails, red lipstick, these things were something that were kind of not only markers of the fashion of the time, but something that even into old age, she always had a red nail,